There are stories that land softly, stories that bruise, and stories that hit like a brick to the ribs, leaving the public gasping while pretending they're not winded. The Bradford fire sits in that last category. The kind of tragedy that forces a country to look at itself, then immediately looks away because the reflection is too ugly, too familiar, too damning. We don't just fail women in this country, we recycle them through the same cycle of danger, escape, survival, and silence until the pattern feels like tradition. And this time, the pattern ended with 4 deaths inside a burning home: a mother, a 9-year-old, a 5-year-old, a toddler barely old enough to say her own name, lives reduced to ashes because a man couldn't tolerate losing control. That's the truth. Strip away the legal language, the newspaper politeness, the court transcripts. What you're left with is entitlement and ego, soaked in petrol and set alight. This entire tragedy began with something deceptively simple: a woman leaving a man. Society treats that like a footnote, but anyone who's lived inside that dynamic knows there's nothing simple about it. Leaving isn't the ending. Leaving is the first chapter of the danger. Antonia didn't just leave a relationship. She left an ecosystem. Years of emotional manipulation, years of controlling behavior, years of being molded into a version of herself that fit within his boundaries of comfort. Abusive men don't just damage, they reprogram. They shrink worlds. They corrode confidence. They twist your perception until you can't tell whether the fear you're feeling is instinct or imagination. So when Antonia finally walked away from Sharaz Ali, that was a revolution. Quiet, determined, life-saving. She stepped out of a cage he thought was permanent. And where did she go? To her sister, Bryonie, because that's what survivors do. They seek softness, a safe harbour, a roof that doesn't feel like a threat disguised as love. But men like Ali don't see escape as survival. They see it as disobedience. That's why abusive men are statistically most dangerous at the moment a woman leaves. It's not coincidence. It's entitlement encountering resistance. And fragile masculinity mixed with loss of control grows violent quickly. Ali didn't spiral randomly. He spiraled with purpose. He fueled himself with drink and drugs, accelerants for a mindset already primed for destruction, then recruited Calum Sunderland, a 26-year-old who apparently had no problem tagging along on a mission that clearly smelled of violence. Some men will protect you, some men will ignore you, and some men will kick in the door while the petrol is being poured. Ali and Sunderland approached Bryonie's house with a 7-litre petrol container. That's not heat of the moment. That's logistics. He didn't snap. He packed fuel, found a ride-or-die idiot to assist, and walked into the night with a plan. CCTV captured it clearly. Ali telling Sunderland to kick the door in like he was directing a low-budget remake of every toxic male fantasy of dominance ever produced. Inside, Antonia was asleep. Bryonie was asleep. The kids, Denisty, Oscar, and Aubree, were asleep. Innocence was asleep. That house was full of love, of routine, of childhood mess, of the warmth that abusive men always underestimate. They think violence can cancel that. It can't. It can only destroy it. Ali storms in. He pours petrol. He rants. He performs the greatest hits of abusive men everywhere. Self-pity posing as anger. Jealousy posing as righteousness. Possession posing as heartbreak. He blames Antonia. He accuses her. He speaks with the entitlement of someone who believes love is ownership. He's not losing his mind. He's expressing exactly what he believes. If I can't control you, I can destroy you. Antonia senses the danger immediately. She runs, not because she's selfish, because survival is instinctive, because trauma hardwires you to assess threats in microseconds, because staying would have added her to the list of the dead, and she runs out of that house with the sound of chaos behind her. But running doesn't save you from guilt, even when guilt isn't yours, especially then. That's the cruelty of trauma. It assigns you responsibility for what other people chose, and trauma is loud. So when she heard the lighter flick, when she heard the fire ignite, when she heard the screams of her sister and her sister's children, that sound didn't escape into the night. It lodged itself permanently inside her. By the time firefighters arrived, the flames had written a final chapter no one could rewrite. 4 lives ended, not because of an accident, not because of fate, not because of circumstance, because a man had options and chose violence, because he wanted to win an argument, because he wanted her to feel fear, because in his mind women and children were collateral damage in the war he waged against his own humiliation. And here's where the country does what it always does. It reacts with shock, as if these stories aren't archived across every city, every police record, every shelter. As if domestic abuse isn't one of the most predictable forms of violence we have. As if warning signs don't exist long before the fire brigade is called. Ali is convicted of murder, Sunderland convicted of manslaughter. Sunderland's role remains the perfect example of how male violence rarely happens in a vacuum. Abusers gather enablers the way mould gathers in damp corners. It doesn't need brilliance or malice, it only needs willing ignorance and a desire to impress. He kicked in that door. He helped create the conditions that killed a family. And yet, society still creates a moral gap between the main offender and the assistant, as though enabling isn't its own form of rot. Antonia's statement outside the courtroom cuts through the noise. She doesn't talk in metaphors or dramatic flourishes. She speaks plain truth. Their futures were stolen. And this country, it never fully understands what that means. A future isn't just a timeline, it's a whole branching structure of possibilities. Birthdays, graduations, first loves, everyday arguments, all the small things that make a life meaningful, gone, erased, burned. But let's talk about the culture, the environment that raises men like Ali, the social norms that give them all the ingredients they need long before they pick up a lighter. We tell girls to protect themselves. We tell boys they'll grow out of bad behavior. We tell women to spot red flags, and we tell men that passion is supposed to be messy, possessive, jealous. We romanticize control as devotion. We mistake obsession for love. He just cares too much. No, that's the problem. He cares the wrong way. He cares inwards, not outwards. He cares about ownership, not well-being. He cares about never being the one who gets left. And when men like Ali lose a relationship, they interpret it as a personal humiliation. Not a choice, not a boundary, not a survival strategy. Humiliation. And humiliation in a man who is already insecure is a flammable emotion. Let's be honest, Britain has a masculinity problem. Not that men shouldn't cry nonsense. The real problem, men who can't emotionally regulate equating rejection with warfare. Men who think love gives them rights. Men who see women leaving as betrayal, not survival. Men who have never been taught to process loss without reaching for destruction. This fire wasn't unpredictable. It was the final step in a long-running formula. Man feels entitled to a woman's life. Woman leaves. Man feels emasculated. Man escalates violence. Family members get caught in the blast radius. Society asks, why does this keep happening? It keeps happening because we refuse to hold men accountable for emotional incompetence until they escalate into physical violence. And by then, the cost is catastrophic. Let's talk about the children again, because they deserve more than being reduced to symbols. Denisty was 9 years old enough to understand fear, old enough to protect younger siblings, old enough to dream. Oscar was 5, probably still learning phonics, probably obsessed with dinosaurs or trucks or superheroes. Aubree was 22 months, still naming colours, still sleeping with a bottle, still being lifted onto hips because she wasn't old enough to climb everywhere she wanted to be. They didn't die because of domestic issues, they died because a man believed his emotional discomfort justified annihilation. And this country has the audacity to call this kind of violence private. Private where? A woman's body is not private property, a home is not a battlefield, and a man's ego is not a justification for murder. We need to stop talking about cases like this as if they're meteor strikes. They're not anomalies, they're symptoms, indicators of a culture that grants men emotional indulgence and gives women emotional responsibility. How could this happen? It happened because we live in a society where women must fear the consequences of their own freedom. What could have prevented this? Teaching men that rejection is not humiliation. Teaching boys that control is not affection. Teaching girls that leaving should not require strategy worthy of a hostage negotiation. We always ask the wrong questions. We ask why she stayed. We should ask why he didn't stop. We ask why she didn't speak up sooner. We should ask why he thought her silence was required. We ask why she didn't predict the danger. We should ask why the danger was allowed to grow unchecked. Ali didn't kill because he broke. He killed because he believed he had the right. And that belief doesn't arise spontaneously. It is built, conditioned, reinforced. And here's the hardest truth. Leaving an abusive man is heroic. Surviving him is luck. Being believed after he harms you is a luxury. And being protected by the system is rare. Antonia survived the fire, but she didn't survive the loss. She didn't survive the guilt that survivors carry even when logic says they're not responsible. She didn't survive untouched. Trauma reshapes you. It rearranges your inner architecture. And she will live with echoes that never quiet down. And society? It'll move on in a week. That's the cycle. Headlines, grief, outrage, silence, next headline. Women don't get to move on. Men like Ali never should have been allowed to move freely in the first place. This fire was not random, it was predictable, preventable, and now irreversible. And unless this country starts teaching boys and men that control is not a birthright, that women are not objects, that rejection is not violence, and that autonomy is not betrayal, then it will happen again. Not maybe, not possibly, inevitably. Women in this country don't escape relationships. They escape men, and too often, not in time. My condolences go to every life touched by this horror, to those who died in that fire, whose futures were stolen, and to those who survived with wounds no sentence can ever heal. May the memories of Bryonie, Denisty, Oscar, and little Aubree never be reduced to headlines, and may Antonia find the strength required to live inside a world that took so much from her. No words can repair what was taken, but respect and remembrance are the least this world owes them. Not right, not left, just real,